Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to my talk. Tonight and over the next several times, I'm going to be talking about aspects of the life of the Buddha. And this evening, what I'd like to talk about is the background to the life of the Buddha. And I know that some people who get interested in Buddhism, they only want to do meditation. I don't need anything else. And that's okay. But I think that a good and a rounded understanding of Buddhism, including the background of us, helps to understand quite important things about the Buddha. So when we know what the world in which he lived was like, it helps us to understand some very important things. So, for example, he addressed certain issues which were needed to be talked about and explained at his time. And he addressed them in very particular ways, in ways that his culture in which he lived found acceptable. And knowing things about, knowing something about what he had to say can help us see what things he was talking about were relevant for that time, but not necessarily relevant for today. And of course, living in a particular culture, he used the language of that culture. He used the terminology, particularly the religious terminology, which was current at the time, and so on. And this helps us to get some idea of how the Buddha presented his Dharma, and that is important. Now, before we start, it might be necessary to talk about a problem which we have to deal with whenever we look at the life of the Buddha, whether it's in the historical context or not. And this is the problem of chronology. So if you study, say, the history of ancient Sumeria or Egypt, for example, there you have historical record, written records going back to even 3,000 years before Christ, BC. That is not the case in India. Writing existed 1,000 years before the Buddha in India, but that writing has never been deciphered so far, and it's probably unlikely to be anyway. So for at least 700 or 800 years, until the time of the Buddha, there was no writing. So we really have very little information about what society was like until we get to the time of the Buddha, where in the Tipitaka, the Pali Tipitaka, we have a great deal of information about society. But it's very difficult to put that in a chronological framework. So for example, we're not really 100% sure when the Buddha lived. So the traditional dates, or the dates that have been accepted as by most scholars until fairly recently, were that he was born in 563 BC and that he passed away in 80 years later, 483, I think it was. But several decades ago, they had an international conference where scholars of Indology and Buddhism and archaeology got together and they re-examined and reassessed the dates of the Buddha, and the general consensus was that he lived 100 years actually later than the traditional dates. That and it's quite possible that finding will change in time too. So for the time being, I'm going to look at the life of the Buddha and the society in which the Buddha lived in, using the traditional dates 563, 483 BC. Then we've got the problem of archaeology. So once again, if you look at the history of ancient Egypt, we've got written records, written on papyrus, and a huge amount of material that tells us a great deal about what that society was like, because the dry deserts of Egypt, like the dry deserts of Mesopotamia preserved so much. Virtually nothing has been preserved, no material culture, very little material culture from the time of the Buddha has been preserved, or earlier. If something was carved out of stone, it still exists. Nothing made of wood or anything has existed. So it's very difficult for us to get exact chronology. Then we've got the chronology of actually the Buddha's biography. So not only don't we know for sure when he was born and when he passed away, we don't know when most of the events in his life took place. As we will see in the next talk, the Tipitaka actually preserves almost no information about the Buddha until he became a wandering ascetic, until he renounced his home life and became a wandering ascetic. And then for the first year and a half after his enlightenment, we have some sort of narrative account. And then for the next 40 or 50 years, until the last year of his life, we don't know really when any of the events in his life took place. We know where many of them took place. We know who he talked to and what he said, but when he did that, we really don't know. So please take into account the fact that chronology surrounding Buddhism is very uncertain. So I'm going to talk about some of the major trends that were happening at the time of the Buddha. So the Buddha lived in what we normally call the Iron Age. Now, iron was discovered in India. It was known in India at least 200 or 300 years before the Buddha. But around his time, maybe 100 years before his time, new streams of iron were found, which were of a much higher quality than before, and also that they were closer to the surface, which made it easier to mine. And so iron became quite common, more common than it had been, and particularly in the area where the Buddha lived, which corresponds roughly to the modern North Indian states of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. And that in turn is the broad, flat valley of the Yamuna and the Ganga River, or the Ganges River. Okay, so iron, this is the shortly after the beginning of the Iron Age in that part of the world. Now, iron had a profound effect upon the culture at that time. So previously, the tip of a farmer's plow had to be made out of wood or sometimes bronze. When it was made out of iron, a farmer was able to cut his furrows much deeper. He was able to plow in areas where he couldn't previously. Another thing about iron was, and perhaps the most important thing about iron, is you were able to make an axe of iron. And that whole area, the Ganges and Yamuna Valley, was heavily forested. So when people had iron axes, they were able to clear the forests much easier, with much less effort and energy than previously. And of course, when areas of forest were cleared, that gave more land for farmers to plant their crops. Now, some historians say that it was at this time that transplantation was started to be practiced. Now, you may know that transplantation allows for a much larger yield of rice. So if you've ever been to Thailand or Burma or a country like that, at around planting time, you will notice what people do. They prepare the paddy field, and they don't just throw the seeds in the paddy field. They throw the seeds in the paddy field, and then they let it sprout, and then they pull it all up and they replant it. They replant each plant a certain distance from the other. And this allows for the grain to grow faster and to have more heads of rice on it. So according to some scholars, transplantation was started to being used at this time. So if that is correct, with the discovery of transplantation and the clearing of the forests and the availability of more land, naturally enough, the population grew. And that's what had started happening at the time of the Buddha. And when you had an increased population, then, of course, farmers, villages which previously had to be near a river, now they could expand into the hinterland. So you had basically a major growth in population. Well, this is what is generally thought. And as a result of that, what were small settlements in forest clearings became villages, and villages gradually evolved into towns, and towns evolved into cities. And when you read the Pali Tipitaka, one of the first things you notice is how frequently cities are talked about, how they're described. There's quite a lot of information about what the city walls were like. There's one sutta where the Buddha talks about the guard who watches the gate to make sure only certain people come in and go out, and he says that somebody who is practicing meditation needs to be like that concerning his mind. So you had the beginning of cities, and this was the first time you had cities in the Indian subcontinent since roughly 900, 1,000 years previously. In the Indus Valley civilization, which had by the Buddha's time well and truly disappeared and been forgotten, at that time you had really quite large urban areas. Then you had a return to very, very small populations and very small centers of population. So roughly around the time of the Buddha, you had the growth of cities. Modern archaeology shows us that cities like Rajagaha, where the Buddha spent several years at the beginning of his ministry, were really very big. And if you go to Rajgir today and you see the huge stone walls built around the city, it's really very impressive. Even more impressive is Kosombi, which is on the bank of the Yamuna River, and the walls there are absolutely enormous. It must have been a very, very large city, and it probably was the largest city at the time of the Buddha. But there were others. You can go to Sravasti, where the Buddha spent roughly the last 20 years of his life, at least in that general area. And if you have been there, you will see the not the walls, but the earthen mounds, long earthen mounds, which took the which were used for defending the city. It is often sort of thought that, you know, people often get the idea that the Buddha spent all of his time in forest glades and mountain caves and what have you. And there is no doubt the Tipitaka makes it clear that the Buddha often went into forest retreats. But primarily, he was an urban man. Most of the people that he talked to were not villagers or country people. They were basically the new urban elite that were evolving at that time. And the Tipitaka gives us a very good idea of the rich social and cultural life of the cities at that time. Some of you will know the famous sutta where the Buddha talks about the bamboo acrobat. There's the master and his apprentice who goes to the top of the pole, and that's used in one of the Buddha's suttas. So this gives us some idea that the streets of the cities at that time, there were street entertainers and minstrels and magicians and people like that, and there would have been wandering ascetics and so on. So there you had the beginning of an urban culture and an urban civilization. And this was very important for the development and the spread of the Buddha's Dhamma. Now, when you had cities, you have the beginning of trade. Now, there had always been trade before the Buddha, but before the development of cities, trade was generally local. If a villager wanted something that he couldn't make, he would get it from the adjoining forest, or perhaps the adjoining village. There would be a potter and he would get pottery from there, or whatever it happens to be. And occasionally there were probably peddlers who sold their goods from one village to another and basically traveled around the country. But when you had cities, of course, it was necessary. There you have a large number of people who are not actually producing food. Then people who are living in the rural areas have to bring their food to the cities, and you've got the beginning of material goods moving from one place to another. You may know that in the Udana there is a sutta where the Buddha talks about, he says, he compares some of the characteristics of the Dhamma with the characteristics of the great ocean. And one of the characteristics of the ocean is that there are pearls and crystal and rubies and conch shells, etc. And this gives us a hint that, so for example, conch shells certainly wouldn't have been available in northern India. They must have been imported from coastal areas and probably from South India. And also the mere fact that we get the mention of precious and semi-precious stones indicates that people had sufficient resources that they could buy what we would generally call luxuries. And all of these, or many of these, would have to be manufactured not necessarily in the city or the town where you lived, but in some other one. So at the time of the Buddha, you had the development of trade and intercontinental trade. That is, even areas far removed from the Ganges Valley, the traders were coming from one place to another. And if you read the Tipitaka carefully, you will know that there are fairly frequent mentions of caravans, of 500 caravans. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, where the Buddha is very tired and he has to rest at the foot of a tree near a river. And according to the sutta, as he is sitting there nearby in the ford on the river, 500 wagons passed by. Now, it's unlikely that any caravans at that time would have had 500 wagons in them. In the Tipitaka, 500 is generally a general term meaning a lot or many. And that's hardly surprising that they would do that. You may ask somebody, have you got enough sugar? And they may say, yes, I've got tons, thank you. Now, they do not mean that they've got several tons of sugar. They mean they've got sufficient. So in the Tipitaka, 500 generally means a lot, not necessarily exactly 500. Although some of the caravans at that time may have had dozens, maybe scores of wagons in them. There was a lot of trade at that time. Okay, so that gives you some idea of the environment in which Buddhism grew up. Now it's necessary to have a look at another important aspect of the Buddha's India, which is religion. Now we have to explain a few things here. Almost everybody believes or thinks that the Buddha lived in a religious background which was predominantly Hindu. And that is almost certainly is not correct. First of all, it is highly unlikely. And the evidence in the Tipitaka is meager, because in the Tipitaka it's mainly talking about some new religions that were evolving at that time. But we certainly get the impression that the majority of people were certainly not Buddhists, and they certainly weren't Hindu. They were almost certainly, like most village people today in India, they are animists. So you can go to any village in India, and now tree worship has become a part of Hinduism. But it was basically folk religion at that time. It's almost certain that the majority of people believed in their little local or regional spirits and gods, and and yakas and bhutas, and some of these were malevolent spirits, some of them were kindly, some of them were malevolent as long as they were treated properly, or they were given enough sacrifices and what have you. It's almost certainly that the majority of people were animists. And now we have to have a look at, what about Hinduism? Well, it might be important to mention that the Buddha couldn't possibly have been a Hindu because Hinduism didn't exist at that time. Now, when you say that, anybody who has even a little knowledge of India will be quite surprised by that. But really, the major organized religion of the time was not Hinduism, which evolved several centuries later. It was what we'd properly called Brahmanism. Now, in some of the better written and more carefully presented books, studies of this time, they will talk about Vedic Hinduism and Puranic Hinduism. So Vedic Hinduism, or I would prefer to use the word Brahmanism, was the religion based on the Vedas. At the time of the Buddha, there were 3 Vedas. In later centuries, there were 4. The 3 Vedas are mentioned very frequently in the Tipitaka. And these were a collection of over 1,000 hymns written some 800 or 900, between about 900 and maybe 1,300 years before the Buddha. And the main gods in Brahmanism were certainly not Shiva or Krishna or Hanuman. They're simply not even mentioned there. They didn't exist at that time. They weren't known at that time. The main gods were Prajapati. He was seen as sort of the creator god. And you had Soma, the god of the moon, and Surya, the god of the sun, Yama, the god of the underworld. Indra was certainly probably the most important. The 2 gods mentioned most frequently in the Vedas are Agni, the god of fire, and Indra, the god of the storms. He was a sort of a warrior god, a storm god. Okay. Now, all those gods later came into Hinduism, but they were sort of already, they're there, but they really don't get much notice. It was other gods, what you call the Puranic gods, Krishna, Vishnu, Shiva, Lakshmi. Those gods started to emerge about in the early Gupta period, maybe 100, 200 AD. And they are what you would call, and what we would recognize today as Hinduism. So it is, if you want to be correct and avoid a lot of confusion, it is important to make a distinction between the religion that was prevalent, the organized religion that was prevalent at the time of the Buddha, which was Brahmanism, or if you'd like, Vedic Hinduism, and what we might call Hinduism or Puranic Hinduism. Now, what was this Brahmanism about? Basically, it centered on the worship of the gods through the Vedic sacrifice. And going right back to the Vedic period, 8,000-9,000 years before the Buddha, it was quite a simple religion in which Brahmins, who were the priestly class, they performed a sacrifice at which grain, milk, ghee, sometimes animals, very occasionally, but sometimes a human being, were sacrificed into the fire. And it was believed that as those offerings were consumed, they were taken up to the gods in the smoke. And as is very clear from the ancient Vedas, people didn't have what we would normally call spiritual aspirations at that time. What they wanted from the gods were very, very worldly things. A fertile wife, a son. They wanted to get rid of their enemies. They wanted victory in battle. There are very few indications of what we call spiritual aspirations, like tranquility, peace, or love. These were not things that people were interested in that time. And the Vedic sacrifices, as they were performed at that time, were basically simple and rather beautiful also. It was the worship of gods of the storm, Aruna, the goddess of the dawn, all these sorts of things. This was the predominant religion at the time. As society moved closer to the time of the Buddha, the Vedic sacrifice became increasingly complex. So that originally, anybody of the first three classes or the first three castes, that is the Brahmins, the priestly caste, the Kshatriyas, the administrative or the warrior class, and the Vaisyas, who were farmers or merchant, they could learn the Vedic hymns, the hymns that were addressed to the gods during the sacrifice. But they had to be learnt by heart. And it was very difficult for the average ordinary person trying to make a living in the world to do that. So gradually, the task of committing the Vedic hymns to memory became basically the job of the Brahmins. And certainly by the time of the Buddha, the belief had evolved that if the hymns were chanted absolutely correctly, then the gods would be compelled to give you what you asked for, to answer your prayers. Previously, originally, as it's understood in the Vedas, you beseech the gods, and because they were happy with your sacrifice, what you offered them in the sacrifice, they might grant you what you wanted. By the time of the Buddha, probably maybe a century or two before, the belief was that your prayers would only be answered if the hymns were chanted absolutely perfectly. And this is important because what it meant was the Vedic Brahmins had to evolve ways to commit the Vedic hymns, of which there's 1,024. I think there's 1,024. Absolutely correctly. They're not the slightest change in intonation of how you pronounce the words. And this is important because we know anybody who has studied the Vedas or Vedic history will tell you that what is preserved in the Vedas, the Vedic hymns, is absolutely perfectly preserved. We know what Indian life and religious beliefs were like 1,000 years before the Buddha because the Vedas simply never changed. Some may have been lost, but what has been preserved is probably pretty much like a tape recording of what was chanted 1,000 years before the Buddha. And why that is important is because, and now I'm getting off the subject a little bit, many of the Buddha's disciples were Brahmins, and they brought to their new religion these memoric skills needed, which they had been trained in, which were needed to preserve as accurately as possible the discourses of the Buddha. We will talk about that sometime later. Anyway, by the time of the Buddha, the Vedic hymns had become, the Vedic sacrifice had become increasingly complex. It had also become increasingly expensive. The offerings that had to be made were sometimes not just elaborate, but extremely expensive. So there's a record in the Tipitaka of a Brahmin sacrificing something like 300 cattle and 60 goats and 50 sheep. And I mean, this was very, very expensive. That's what was thrown into the sacrificial fire. Then you had to pay the Brahmins. And once again, there are a lot of criticisms in the Tipitaka, and incidentally in other literature too, like the Vedas, of Brahmins demanding very large amounts of money for their services, because without their knowledge of the hymns, the Vedic sacrifice would not work. So there was increasing dissatisfaction with the way that Brahmanism had evolved. It is also true that now that you had urban civilizations where people had more free time and they were basically changing, people's intellectual understanding was changing, there was increasing dissatisfaction with how reality was understood in the Vedas, and people started looking for new explanations of things. And that is important too, and it is very apparent from the suttas that there was a lot of fermentation, religious and intellectual fermentation at the time of the Buddha, and you may very well say that the Buddha was a child of that, as were many of his disciples and the people that he dialogued with. So that was so we have these, first of all, the widespread acceptance of animism, and then you had the major organized religion of the time, which was Brahmanism, or Vedic Hinduism, if you like. And then you had another, not so much a religion, but a religious movement. And this was what was called, you could say, the religion of a group of ascetics called the Samanas. Shamana in Sanskrit. Now, I've heard people say, and I used to think it myself too, that the word samana comes into English as shaman, but that is not correct. There is no connection between them. Samanas were basically they were ascetics, they were homeless, they were generally fairly hostile to Brahmanism. And their origin is really not known. Where they came from, what their origin was, is not really known. Now, until recently, most scholars believe that the Samana movement began roughly with this urbanization, dissatisfaction with life, the problems of living close to other people, all the problems that you get with urban civilization. A few scholars are now arguing that in actual fact, the Samana tradition was very ancient, and it was sort of indigenous to northern India. Whereas Brahmanism, or Vedic Hinduism, certainly we know for certain that began further west from the Ganges Valley in what today is Western Punjab, which is parts of northern Pakistan, and parts of eastern Afghanistan. And we do know this because the Vedas mention the name of various rivers which still have those names. We know this because the main crop grown in the Ganges Valley is rice, and rice is not even mentioned in the Vedas. Barley is. Barley is a crop that grows in drier areas where there is less water. Rice, for that you need water, and that's the Ganges Valley, which is a very high rainfall. And other hints in the Vedas let us know, they prove to us that the Vedas began much further west from the land where the Buddha lived. And it seems likely that over the centuries, Brahmanism gradually moved into the area where the Buddha lived, so that by the time of the Buddha, Brahmanism was fairly well established in the world of the Buddha. And indeed, Brahmins and Brahmin rituals and Brahmin concepts are mentioned by the Buddha and often criticized by him almost everywhere in the Tipitaka, as is the caste system, which of course was a Brahminical concept as well. Anyway, some scholars now are arguing, and I think that they have very cogent arguments for this, that the Samana tradition actually was indigenous to central India, the area where the Buddha lived, and that it had a very ancient origin. But we don't know because we have very, very little evidence of them survive. One piece of what might be evidence that Brahmanism was very ancient, the Samana tradition was very ancient, was in both Buddhism and Hinduism, you have the idea of great past masters. So in Buddhism, you've got the idea of past Buddhas. In Jainism, which is a Shamana religion also, you have the idea of previous Tirthankaras, which are basically the Jain equivalent to Buddhas. So at the time of the Buddha himself and Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, both believed that they were the most recent of previous enlightened beings, Buddhas or Tirthankaras. And this suggests to some scholars that in actual fact, they looked back to, and that there really were shamanas long ago, before the present. And I think that this is quite likely. The second reason for this is that the Samana tradition is in almost every way at odds with Brahmanism. Brahmanism was a very family-oriented religion. They were really into what is now called family values. So the ideal for somebody in the Brahminical religion was to have a wife, a faithful wife, as many sons as possible, lots of cows, and generally wealth. It was all about the family. And some of these ideas still exist in India today. One of the reasons why Indians today, by their millions, are interested in whether the child that their wife is carrying, is a boy or a girl, is because they don't want a girl. They want a boy. Why? Because according to Brahmanism, only a son can perform the funeral rites for his parents. Without the son, it's in the Vedas, it's in the Upanishads, it's in the Brahmana Shastras, all these works, you must have a son. So the Samanas, of course, they were, you might say, rather anti-family. The Buddha was the classic example of this. So was Mahavira, the founder of Jainism. They walked out on their family. In the case of the Buddha, he happened to have had a son before he left, but not so that his funeral could be conducted by his son. It just worked out that way. There are several places in the Tipitaka where Brahmins express their horror at the idea that somebody would turn their back on their family, on worldly wealth, on their social obligations, and go off and live in the forest. But this is what the Samanas did. And we know, once again, from the Tipitaka, you look in the Samanyapala Sutta, it talks about, or it mentions the names of some of the popular Samana teachers of that time. Ajita Kesa Kombali and all these guys. And they had come into prominence at that time. They had probably always existed, but now there was an increased interest in what they had to say, including by some people in the Brahminical tradition. As we said, there was an increasing dissatisfaction with the Vedic explanations of reality, and many people, including some Brahmins, were looking for new explanations, and they were starting to explore the Samana tradition. And this is probably one of the reasons why there are many suttas where Brahmins come to the Buddha and ask him, well, what's your vision of reality? Now, the Samanas, for the most part, were itinerant. That is, they wandered for 9 months of the year from one place to another, pretty much like Hindu swamis do nowadays. You might say today's Hindu swamis are the distant descendants of the Samanas. So they were itinerant. They were usually celibate, although not all of them. They were mendicant. They had no property, so they begged for everything that they needed, including their food. And if what the Samana Pala Sutta tells us about, it gives us a very rough and rather unclear account of the beliefs or the teachings of some Samana traditions, most of them seem to have been either agnostic or even non-theist, or we might even say atheist. Jainism certainly was and always has been, and so was the Buddha. So and so because they rejected the idea of a supreme being, most of them, their idea that the secrets of existence had to be understood by, in some ways, transforming the mind. So whereas in the Brahminical tradition, they prayed to the gods for what they wanted, for what they needed, for what they desired, the Samanas were looking within. They were hoping to transform their mind, thinking that a new and a clearer vision would help them understand the nature of reality. So this is when basically yoga began. Now, of course, we think of yoga as being a Hindu practice, which it is now, but it certainly wasn't at that time. It was a part of the Samana tradition. They experimented with sensory deprivation, going off into forests and caves, being living in complete solitude. Some people think that the use of psychedelic drugs, mainly the soma plant, whatever it was, and what's the other one, very popular nowadays, marijuana, was being used, but there's no evidence, at least in the Pali Tipitaka, of the use of any form of drug-induced mental transformation. And of course, they did things like particular types of meditation. So when Prince Siddhartha went to his teachers, first of all, Ara Lama Kalama and Udakarama Putta, they taught him particular types of meditation. So this was what the Samanas were doing. And in that sense, their understanding of reality and how some form of liberation or could be attained was not through the gods, but through radically changing the mind. Now, when the Buddha decided to leave his home, it seems that he took it for granted that the Samana tradition was where the solution to the problems he wanted to solve could be found. There is no evidence that he sought to study with a Brahmin teacher. It seems that from the very beginning, his focus was on the inner world, not the outer world. Now, the Samana tradition, of all the various teachers of that time, and there were certainly more than those mentioned in the Samana Pala Sutta, almost all of them disappeared within a few centuries. The only ones that were survived were, of course, Buddhism and Jainism, and one other one which was called those who followed it were called the Ajivikas. So Ajivikaism probably existed for another few hundred, maybe 500 or 600 years, and then it gradually petered out. All of the others disappeared or were gradually transformed into something else. And by the time that Hinduism began to evolve, it absorbed the Samana tradition into itself. And now the Samana tradition, Hinduized, of course, is represented by the Hindu swamis, sadhus, and sannyasis that we're all familiar with. Okay, but at that time, at the time of the Buddha in the 5th century, 4th century BC, they were pretty much the exact opposites to each other. So this is very briefly the religious background at the time of the Buddha. This was what was going on in the world that the Buddha was born into. Now I want to mention very briefly one other thing. You often read that, in fact, I've even read it in encyclopedias, that the Buddha adopted or copied certain ideas from the Upanishads. Now, the Upanishads are a collection of ancient texts which were composed and compiled by people in the Brahminical tradition who were, as I mentioned before, becoming dissatisfied with traditional understanding of the Vedic religion. They remained within the Vedic tradition, but they started to rather radically transform the Vedic tradition and reinterpret it in very new and creative ways. And the general consensus is that at least there are what are called 12 principle Upanishads, which are generally believed to be the earliest and the most important. And the general feeling amongst scholars is that 4 or 5 of these are pre-Buddhist. And that the Buddha adopted or copied the idea of karma and rebirth from the Vedas, from the Upanishads, sorry. Now, there are a few problems with this belief or this widespread assumption. The first of all is what we talked about at the very beginning, chronology. It's very, very difficult to date for certain the dates of the Buddha, just as it is very uncertain to date when the Upanishads were composed. We simply don't know. The second thing is that if the Buddha did copy the idea of karma and rebirth from the Upanishads, from somewhere else, this casts some aspersions on what he claimed. And he claimed that what he taught had not been known before, and he mentions that quite frequently. Now, I don't claim to be a scholar of the Vedas or Vedic religion, but I've done something which almost nobody very few people who make these statements do, which is that I've read and studied the Upanishads. I have this wonderful translation by Patrick Oliville. It's a very thick book with annotations and notes. And when you read them all, as opposed to reading a contemporary interpretation of the Vedas, of the Upanishads, you find that some of them don't mention karma or rebirth. And in fact, the Kasi Upanishad clearly says nobody knows what happens when a person dies. So my general feeling, I have to study the matter, is that it seems very unlikely to me that the Buddha copied the idea of karma and rebirth from the Upanishads. It seems to me much more likely that it was the other way around. So, for example, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the sage who is teaching the idea of rebirth, first of all, he says it's an idea that the Brahmins have not known before. And in another passage, he says it's a secret teaching. He says this to his students. It's a secret teaching. Don't tell anybody else. Now, why would a great sage tell his students not to tell anybody else? And my interpretation of this is that he wanted to avoid the accusation of unorthodoxy from other Brahmins, and that he, in fact, had been influenced by the Samana tradition. Now, not all the Samana teachers taught the idea of karma and rebirth, but one we know for certain did, and that was Mahavira, the founder of Jainism. And we know that Jainism probably predated the Buddha Mahavira predated the Buddha by about 10 years, maybe 12 or 13 years. But when you look at the Jains' ideas of karma and rebirth, they are really quite distinct. They are clearly a version of karma and rebirth, but they are different in quite important ways from the Buddhist version. So I will say this, that I don't think the evidence that the Buddha copied the idea of karma and rebirth from the Upanishads is particularly, that there's not really very good evidence for that. It is certainly possible that he was influenced by Jainism, because Mahavira was teaching ideas like that some decade before the Buddha. Another possible explanation, of course, is that Mahavira had insights through his meditation practice. And I believe that after the Buddha, Mahavira was certainly one of probably the second or the third greatest religious teacher of all times. And he certainly had deep and profound religious experiences. I think it's quite possible that in his meditation practice, he had glimpses of the concept of karma and rebirth, but partial ones, which the Buddha's experience and his realizations was able to see more clearly and therefore teach more accurately. That's my interpretation. I think that there are the main things that can be said about the background to the Buddha. First of all, if we're looking at the life and the teachings of the Buddha, we've got to take into account, and the other religions of the time, we've got to take into account the problem of chronology. It's very difficult for us to know who came first, who came later, and so on. We also said that if you want to get a good and a well-grounded understanding of the Dhamma, some knowledge of the world in which it developed is very helpful. We talked about the importance of iron in the transformation of the society in which the Buddha came to be born. We talked about the clearing of the forests, the expansion of food, which led to the increase in population, which led to the transformation of villages and towns into cities, then trade and the development of a rich and sophisticated social life. Then we talked about Brahmanism and its importance within the religious world of the Buddha, and the Samana tradition, and we just finished with talking about some of my ideas about the relationship between Buddhism and the Upanishads. In fact, recently I wrote an article looking at some of the ideas of karma and rebirth as mentioned in a few of the Upanishads, and some of the other ideas of why things happen and destiny after death, which are also mentioned in the Upanishads. So I've written something about that. I will try to make it available to anybody who's interested, and you may find it interesting. And with that, I'll finish tonight. Thank you, and I hope you found that interesting. Good night.